Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to Richard for stepping in after the local councillors declined. I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about them. So this is Ian Hollidge from Bexhill. He declined saying, oh, I've heard all the arguments before. Just to give you a little bit of background on him in his own words, as he's not here to represent himself, this is a direct quote from him at a recent East Sussex Pension Committee meeting. Stop trying to say that a fossil fuel company is bad. They're not a fossil fuel company. They are an energy company, and they are in the midst of a transition. Wow, there you go. So he's number one. Still come. Now we've got Paul Redstone, who has been fleeing his local constituents and refusing to engage with them for the last 6 months. He got back to say he wasn't going to come, but he had a key question for those in favour of fossil fuels. Do they use fossil fuels themselves? It reminded me of this famous internet meme here. It's called "We Should Improve Society Somewhat," and it depicts, for those of you at the back, a surf, grey-faced surf weighed down by sticks, saying, "We should improve society somewhat," and a cheeky chappy here saying, but yet you participate in society. I'm so clever. So anyway, that's Paul Redstone. And last but not least, although he is smaller because I had less time to make him, we've got Councillor Fox here, seen in a recent pension committee meeting. He's the chair. He's been resisting it for many years. He has the signal honour to have refused to answer a fairly straightforward question about the fund about climate change. I think over 300 times. It was submitted by 300 different people on multiple occasions. Where it's basically saying, do you agree? Will you accept publicly that we're not going to get on a 1.5 degree trajectory unless the big fossil fuel companies are on a 1.5 degree trajectory? Not a trick question, but he refused to answer that one. So he didn't want to come either. One can only speculate as to the reasons why they might not want to come. So this is Sarah. Where's mine? You take that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about divestment and engagement. So what do we mean by fossil fuel divestment? Well, we're talking about fossil fuel divestment campaigns. What's that about? It's about getting institutions like a pension fund or a philanthropic fund or an educational institution like a university to make a highly visible public commitment to ditch investments in a particular company or set of companies. And the rationale behind it is that this is a way of driving restrictive legislation on this company or set of companies by government through a process of social stigmatization. So it's sometimes referred to as you're undermining these companies or the company's social license to operate. So again, highly visible. It's about undermining the company's social license to operate, and it's about getting governments to intervene and put in place restrictive legislation. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, right. So, what is engagement? What do we mean by engagement? We can see that there, but we're also going to talk about what does the evidence say about engagement as a tool. There was a report that Dr. Ellen Quigley, who's the co-director of finance for environmental, social, systemic change, and also the special advisor for responsible investment to the chief financial officer, both at Cambridge University. She was the co-author of a very important report on the relative merits of divestment and engagement for Cambridge University. Her conclusions were that, quote, responsible investment in its current guise is not fit for purpose as a means to address systemic risks, particularly climate change. Indeed, it has met with manifest failure. Emissions have continued to grow unabated, climate risk to the real economy has increased, and ESG, which means environmental, social and governance, which is an investment approach that incorporates shareholder engagement, appears to have resulted in no genuine change in company behaviour.
So, obviously the terms of this debate are set more broadly than simply fossil fuel companies. So we're focusing on fossil fuel companies in our presentation. Hopefully in the discussion we can talk about it, broaden it out a little bit, and I'm sure Richard's going to talk about other things as well. But in relation to fossil fuel companies, it shouldn't come as a surprise that shareholder engagement has failed. Because what is the appropriate ask of a fossil fuel company at this particular point in human history? It is basically that fossil fuel company should cease to be a fossil fuel company very rapidly. So in the next 25, 30 years, these companies, this entire sector, has to be phased out of existence. And there is not, to my knowledge, there's not a single example. We've asked the councillors at County Hall to provide a single example of a company which has fundamentally changed its core business model. So in this example, it will be a fossil fuel company ceasing to be a fossil fuel company and becoming some totally different sort of company as a result of shareholder engagement. And there is certainly no example in human history of an entire sector of companies ceasing to be what they are and changing into something else as a result of shareholder engagement in this fashion. So it's not a surprise, I think, that fossil fuel companies, that engagement hasn't worked in relation to fossil fuel companies. It's kind of an insane approach to take, if you ask me. But let's have a look at another piece of evidence. So this is Tarek Fancy. He was the chief investment officer for responsible investing at BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset management companies. And he resigned from that position a few years ago. And I'll give you a quote from him. He said, "My responsibilities at BlackRock included incorporating ESG, this approach which is a bit broader than shareholder engagement, but which includes it as a central part, incorporating ESG into the investment processes that govern the world's largest pool of investment assets. But I quickly learned that ESG isn't as useful to investing as I had hoped. Going through the investment process is a bizarre place to try to create social impact in the first place. Systemic problems, such as a global pandemic or climate change, require systemic solutions. Only governments have the wide-ranging powers, resources, and responsibilities that need to be brought to bear on the problem." And because this was a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, he drew this analogy with COVID. He said, waiting for the market to figure itself out is absurd. It's like leaving bars open during the pandemic and hoping people will be responsible. It won't work. It will spread infection, cost lives, prolong the pandemic, and force bar owners to wait even longer before they can safely reopen. Yet the speed, decisiveness, and extraordinary tools governments used to quickly bend down the COVID-19 infections curve are nowhere to be found in dealing with the climate crisis. And he made another point which I think is relevant here. He said, he came to the conclusion that ESG is actually, and shareholder engagement is actually what he called a deadly distraction. And he said it was like giving wheatgrass to a cancer patient, quote, medically harmless, but if that wheatgrass convinces the patient to delay chemotherapy, it's a complete disaster.
Now we get on to what our specific campaign has been about, which is the East Sussex Pension Fund. Now, I'm a member of the East Sussex Pension Fund. I don't know about anybody else here, but I am a member. And it shocks me that they've recently spent £55,000 on this report, Engagement versus Divestment, to try and fight off the now 10-year-long campaign for it to divest from fossil fuels. Had a lot of trouble actually being allowed to see this report, didn't we? But finally they've released it. And even this report concluded that the attribution of climate action gains to make the case for engagement activity remains difficult to demonstrate. That's bearing in mind that the people they chose to write the report were probably people that were not in favour of divestment. They weren't. I don't think they were unbiased people. Oh, that's maybe a bit provocative to say that, but they weren't. Anyway, so yeah, that's what they said.
Okay, so we've given you 3 pieces of evidence there. One of which is independent academics who surveyed the very wide range, if not the entire range, of academic evidence on engagement that's available when they wrote that report for Cambridge University. Tarek Fancy, who was the responsible investment guy for BlackRock, and the East Sussex Pension Fund itself, quoted against itself in some respects. I would say difficult to demonstrate is a euphemism here. I mean, really couldn't find anything. Well, nothing worth putting in. So, again, I think it's worth going back and looking at the fossil fuel companies, and for definiteness, let's look at oil and gas, and the scale of the failure here. So, despite many years, and in the case of Exxon, I think decades of engagement, there is not a single oil and gas company which is currently in the world, which is currently on a 1.5 degree compliant path. Here, this is another illustration of the depths of the hole that we're in. Even if all coal extraction was to finish tomorrow and there were to be no new oil and gas projects, we would still need to shut down a fifth of the existing developed oil and gas reserves in order to have a 50-50 chance of meeting the the international climate goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, holding global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this line here is the budget for 1.5. This is oil plus gas in the developed reserves. And this is all fossil fuels, and that's coal. And you can see oil and gas alone in the developed projects exceeds the 1.5 degree budget there. And yet, without exception, with no known exceptions, there's not a single oil and gas company in the world that isn't continuing to approve and go forward with new projects.
In the 3 years following the Paris Agreement, the 5 largest publicly traded oil and gas majors, which is ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, BP and Total, have invested over $1 billion of shareholder funds on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying. So we can see where their interests lie. According to the is it called the Influence Map? Who did these reports? These efforts are overwhelmingly in conflict with the goals of this landmark global climate accord, i.e. the Paris 2015, and designed to maintain the social and legal license to operate and expand fossil fuel operations.
So what's the evidence in favour of divestment, or what's the evidence about divestment? Well, as we said above or before, divestment aims to try and change government policy and legislation through a process of socially stigmatising particular sector of companies or a company. And in 2013, a group of academics at the Oxford University's Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment wrote a report. This is the cover. And as part of that report, they looked back at previous global divestment campaigns. And their conclusion was that in almost every, and I quote, in almost every divestment campaign we reviewed, from adult services to Darfur, from tobacco to South Africa, divestment campaigns were successful in lobbying for restrictive legislation affecting stigmatized firms. So there is a historical evidence base for this divestment approach actually winning what it tries to do. Restrictive legislation on the firms concerned. In relation to fossil fuels, obviously there's a very big ask ultimately that we need. We need to actually phase out the fossil fuel sector, which is still the predominant form of energy that we use in the world. So obviously a massive ask, but it is one tool that has a proven evidence base for it.
When we're being told by people in East Sussex that, it's impossible, we can't do any of this, and anyway, you're still using fossil fuels, blah, blah, blah. Yes, we are at the moment, but we're talking about phasing out, we're not talking about tomorrow, and they don't seem to quite get that point. To date, over 1,600 institutions in the world, with a collective value of $40.7 trillion, mind-boggling figure, have made some form of divestment commitment. So there has been a divestment commitment. It's not like East Sussex are going to be the first people to ever do this in the world, or even in the country.
And just one indication of the impact that the fossil fuel divestment movement has had. This is Christine Figueres, who was the UN's chief climate negotiator between 2010 and 2016. So during the period where the Paris Agreement was agreed. She says, I quote, she identified fossil fuel divestment as, quotes, a primary driver of success at the Paris climate talks in 2015. And so just to be clear, that's not because some people sold some shares from a company and the company's price went down and then they said, we've been a bad company and now we're going to be a good one. It was because it helped to undermine the power of the fossil fuel industry so that you could actually get the Paris Climate Agreement passed. Now, people in this room probably don't need me telling you that Paris Climate Agreement is deeply flawed. So it doesn't go far enough, fast enough. it also doesn't mention fossil fuels. So, but that game is still in play that in terms of the politics. Okay. So, again, very quickly, an argument that sometimes comes up, certainly in relation to the East Sussex pension fund stuff, is, oh, it's very nice to be able to do this, but we couldn't take the hit. Well, there were 2 independent reports, one produced by BlackRock, one produced by Mercator, again, 2 of the world's largest financial management firms. They concluded from a survey of different institutions that have made divestment commitments around fossil fuels that they'd experienced no negative financial impacts from divesting from fossil fuels. And in fact, at that point, they found evidence of modest improvement in fund return. And in line with this, the Sussex pension fund's own report that it put out, once you peel back the layers of obfuscation and defining fossil fuel company to mean something that it didn't and various other things, various little games that were played, actually, as far as I can make out, actually demonstrated that it would be relatively easy for the East Sussex Pension Fund to make the divestment campaign that campaigners from across the county and Brighton and Hove have been calling for the last 10 years, with no significant repercussions for the fund's overall strategy.
Just to conclude with some sample myths. Myth 1 is that fossil fuel companies are part of the solution, offering the potential to play a substantial role in the transition to renewables, which is what these guys have been saying to us quite a lot. The reality is that fossil fuel companies' investments in renewables remain tiny. For example, 1.5% of Shell's capital expenditure goes on renewables, despite this lovely picture they've got here on this advert. Unless paired with steep cuts in fossil fuel production, such investments amount to little more than greenwash. And even the International Energy Agency, who have long been aligned with the fossil fuel sector, doesn't see fossil fuel companies becoming major players in renewables. So that's quite interesting.
And on that last part, there was a report that the IEA put out last November, and when they say globally, fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies are responsible for 1% clean energy investments globally. And they said that their role in renewables was, and I quote, marginal at best. Okay, so another common myth is that you're just moving the problem elsewhere. You are selling the stocks and the shares to somebody else, and you were a good investor, an ethical investor. You wanted the right things to happen. And now there's an evil investor who doesn't have your concerns, and it would be terrible if they got hold of the shares. Well, as we've seen already, there's 2 things to say about that. One of which is, given the record that we've just surveyed of what happens when the good people have the shares, there's not really much to lose if the bad people have the shares. But more importantly, the rationale for divestment isn't to try and impact share price or whatever of an individual company, to try and do it at a company level. It's that process of social stigmatization. It's trying to break the political deadlock, the political headlock that the fossil fuel sector as a whole has had the international and national political processes across the globe for a very long time. So people may have seen last year, The Guardian had a report. They said over a 50-year period, the last 50 years, fossil fuel sector has been making profits of $3 billion a day, right? And that enables you to buy a lot of political systems and to exert an enormous amount of influence over the international political process. And it's that divestment is trying to break.
And then, just as a reminder from some famous people here, Antonio Guterres from the UN, Secretary General, he said in 2023, he said, no more excuses, no more greenwashing, no more bottomless greed of the fossil fuel industry and its enablers. I have a special message for fossil fuel producers and their enablers scrambling to expand production and raking in monster profits. If you cannot set a credible course for net zero with 2025 and 2030 targets covering all your operations, you should not be in business. Your core product is our core problem.
Yeah. And I think the reality is that shareholder engagement is just not going to bring that about. And indeed, provides cover for the continuation of business as usual, business with only minor tinkering. And again, just to wheel in everybody's favourite champion of the environment, David Attenborough, he put it very simply. There's a lot of complexities in here, but at the core, I think it is a very simple thing, expressed very pithily here by David Attenborough. although albeit possibly without a plural that he should have stuck in. But anyway, this is from his documentary that he made for the BBC a few years back about climate change. And he says, it's crazy that our banks and our pensions are investing in fossil fuel when these are the very things that are jeopardising the future that we're saving for. Thank you.
Okay. And so, on the other side of the argument, giving a very informed perspective, Richard, round of applause.
So I'm kind of on the other side of the argument. I agreed with a worrying amount of what the two of them just presented, and I'm not representing the cardboard cutouts. Whether we're on the engage side of the argument or the divest side of the argument, we're trying to achieve very much the same thing. And that is going back to the Paris Agreement target of keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees if that is impossible, to move away from fossil fuels. And yes, as Gabriel mentioned, incredibly in the whole COP process, it's only in the last COP, COP28, that for the first time the word fossil fuel has come into the final statement in a slightly sort of watered down phrase. But it's incredible that they've been going for almost 30 years and haven't really addressed the main issue. And again, going back to the International Energy Agency and also the UN organization responsible for climate change, they've made it very clear that you can't reach that target if we are going to do any kind of new fossil fuel projects. And as we've seen, there are new projects underway. And the main objective is to, whether by divestment or engagement, to encourage or force big oil companies to pay attention to the above and change their ways. So what do we mean when we say engagement? So I already touched on it, that it's been going on for a long time. If any big shareholder, like a pension fund or an insurance company, invests tens of millions of pounds in a company, they want it to increase in value, and so they tend to want to start a dialogue with that company. So the engagement involves, and I think you already defined this, it's starting a dialogue with companies. It's also referred to under the umbrella term of stewardship, you might have heard, or active ownership. So it's basically, you don't just buy something and forget about it. You buy something and you want to kind of nurture it and make it better, make it increase in value. And in the case of sustainability, you want to make it, be a better corporate citizen and stop wrecking the planet, possibly. The other thing about engagement is divest and engage are not exclusive things. You can spend a long time engaging, and if you find that nothing's happening, which is the case with some of my old clients, they would have a blacklist. And very publicly, they would, they might take a few years of trying to get these companies to change, and if nothing happened, then they would put them on the blacklist and basically divest. So does it work? I think it's worth looking at what has been achieved. And if you do look back at the beginnings of Climate Action 100 Plus or other similar initiatives, the oil companies who, as we've seen, and I totally agree, I spent a lot of my time just railing against the oil companies. They're awful. Let's just get that one out of the way. But they were arguably somewhat worse 10 years ago, before anyone started hassling them. They were openly kind of funding climate science denial. They were doing all kinds of lobbying, which they're still doing, but more and more of that is coming out into the open now, and they're getting a much harder time of it. So you mentioned Influence Map. They have their Lobby Map platform, which is fantastic. You can go in there and look up companies and see what they've been doing behind the scenes, often while posting nice pictures of their kind of green credentials. They are paying academics to create bogus papers denying climate science, and they're lobbying against climate action and things like that. but they are finding it harder and harder and harder to do it. Now, I spoke about size, and I think size does count. I've got this slide here just to give you a sense of perspective. So these numbers are the total value of all the shares that are on the market in these big oil companies. So you've got 379 billion pounds worth of Exxon shares sloshing around that people have in their pension funds and whatever. And in comparison, that's roughly the size of the entire East Sussex pension fund. So that's the total assets under management, including bonds and private equity and all kinds of other stuff. So you can imagine, I mean, even to have 1% of ExxonMobil, you'd need 3.7 billion pounds worth, which is almost the entire pension fund. So in terms of influence and leverage that you'd have as an individual institutional investor, even though you've got 4.5 billion pounds, you're kind of a little bit of a drop in the ocean. So I've explained what engagement is, who is involved in it. Does it work? This is just one example I found of, it's a Dutch asset manager called Robeco. And again, it gives you an idea of how long this process takes. They started, it's almost a decade they spent engaging with this utility company. It's a utility company that was using a lot of coal and, apart from that, oil and gas to generate its energy. And they worked very, very hard, and using all the tools available in Italy, you can, as a minority shareholder, you can propose people to be on the board of companies, and they used that mechanism to put a climate expert in place. And basically, over time, this company's gone from being a really awful emitter to actually improving dramatically, moving very fast towards renewables. You know, engagement in theory, I still think is a good idea. I've done a handy color-coded pros and cons of divestment here. So in green, again, divestment would hurt companies if done at a very large scale. You know, East Sussex County Council getting rid of its oil and gas companies isn't going to impact Exxon or Shell or whoever it might be. You know, they're not going to lose sleep over it. Having said that, in theory, if you know, you had whatever it was, 180 billion pounds worth of Shell shares, if 100 billion of them decided to get out, that would definitely make them think, at least. It's a bad look, and I think that's the point you were making. It's a signal. It's they're spewing out all this greenwashing. Look at us, we're investing 1% into renewables, but we're investing probably 10% into marketing, and they have all this nice stuff. So it's a good signal. It's for me, it's part of a whole range of tools one can use with these companies. It's possibly peace of mind for scheme members. So if people find it obnoxious to hold oil and gas shares, this is one way of keeping those people happy and giving them peace of mind. They're also more kind of getting away from altruism. Pension funds are long-term investors. They think in decades. And when you're thinking forwards with, you know, different climate scenarios, depending on how the world moves, if people get their act together and start moving to a low carbon economy as they should, then these oil companies that haven't been investing in all that stuff, they are going to lose value. And so forgetting all kinds of altruism or you know, ethical ideas, it'd be just a bad investment. They could end up being what we call stranded assets. So that's another reason, which is a valid reason. And then some of the, you know, areas where maybe I think it's a little bit weaker. The shares, I mean, typically we're talking about shares in the secondary market. So those shares that you buy in Shell or BP, you're buying them from someone else. You're not buying them from Shell or BP. And the money doesn't go to fund new oil projects. Those oil projects are typically funded by banks, and through bond issuances and things like that. And actually that's a whole different theme, and that's where I think we need a lot more people like you in front of banks. I don't know if you can double up or you've got some friends, but I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. Because that's where, the absurdity of all this money going into new oil projects is really, it's one thing winding down what's already there, and indeed we do still use fossil fuels. You can't just switch it off overnight. I was talking to whichever one of the guys had asked that question. But the funding of new oil projects, clearly everyone who knows anything about anything has said, you just can't do it. It's going to blow everything. So we need to talk to the banks, and selling BP shares doesn't really have any impact on those new oil projects. Apart from, there's good stuff here, which let's not forget. If you sell your shares, you also lose your ability to engage. Now, if you think engagement is useless, then that's not a problem. But if, like me, you think it's worth doing alongside other things, and maybe as a precursor to divestment, you can't engage as easily if you don't have shares in the company. You can't vote at AGMs, which, as I've just said, is that's where the tide is turning. People want to start actually using their votes more and hitting the company directors where it hurts. There's even climate litigation going on, and it's a lot easier to litigate. I mean, some litigation's done by NGOs and environmental organizations, but also shareholders have initiated climate-related litigation against. They've basically sued companies saying, we invested in your shares, but you're doing all this stuff that means you're going to end up stranded, and you've got reputational risks, and you're going to lose value. So we can sue you. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking just about oil and gas here. Now, if you divest from the oil and gas giants like Shell and BP, I mean, so much climate change is also, and so many emissions come from plastics, from petrochemicals, from food and agriculture. I basically, if we stopped using fossil fuels overnight, as we've established we can't do, but if we did, we would still overshoot the 1.5 target just from food and agriculture. So my point there is, if you divest from oil and gas companies, using the same logic, I would go through the whole portfolio, and I would take out McDonald's, PepsiCo, Nestle, Danone, all these, and there are all sorts of other obscure chemicals companies, BASF or whoever, that are doing mining companies. So I don't know whether that's like a major argument, because obviously you have to focus on one theme, but just as a concept of divestment, if you want to get all the bad stuff that is wrecking the planet out of the portfolio, you might not end up with that much in the pension fund left. There are some other bad guys out there. So, and then this point here, you weren't a big fan of that, but I think it's kind of valid in the end. If we assume that the difficulties that people engaging face are going to improve and it becomes more effective, then I'd rather have those shareholders taking on that battle than offloading those shares to some, hedge funds or whoever they might be, who really don't care. They just they take the shares and they don't make even those imperfect efforts to improve the world. And finally, selling the shares doesn't actually change greenhouse gas emissions in the short term. It's not like perhaps putting a stop on new oil and gas projects. That I think would have a bigger impact. My point is, it's complicated. Engagement is worth doing. It's hard to do. If it's not being done right, it needs to be done better. I think people need to vote against. They need to stop this fear of upsetting company directors. And we're seeing company directors being sued now for climate related things. So I think people need to just up the ante and get a bit more aggressive, and engagement in itself is not a bad thing. ESG investing is not a bad thing, despite what Tarek Fancy would say. It's stuff that can be improved, but it's worth doing. And in some cases, where it fails, then you divest. Which again, unfortunately, this should be a real ding-dong between engage and divest, but we agree on, I think, too many things. So this was my conclusion slide. I think I've already mentioned some of these things. I think at small scale, I touched on that. I think the engagement works well when you have some clout. And unfortunately, £4.5 billion in itself isn't even enough clout. You've seen the scale, just one company with a couple of 100 billion in outstanding shares. You need to like big investors pooling together and actually being a bit more aggressive in their engagement. You touched on it, Gabriel. I think we need systemic change. We need governments to make the business model that fossil fuel companies operate unviable. So I would say, get out and vote. Vote for a better government that is going to not finance 100 new North Sea oil licenses, for example, just randomly mentioning that, and ideally change the whole voting system to proportional representation. But that's a whole different debate. Anyway, I've spoken enough.
So I think, in some respects, Richard closed by making the argument for me. Ultimately, this is going to be down to government action. That's what divestment is about. It's about bringing in legislation and policy, albeit indirectly. It's not about pressuring companies on an individual basis to decide not to become oil companies and phase themselves out of existence when it comes to fossil fuel companies. It's simply not what it's about. It's about driving government action, and it has a track record of doing that. If you remember the ozone hole, the problem with the ozone hole was not dealt with by shareholders pressuring chlorofluorocarbon companies to stop being refrigeration companies, or whatever the analogy would be. It was solved essentially by having an international convention to phase out those chemicals, the Montreal Convention, Montreal Protocol. We need a fossil fuel treaty. We need an organised process to phase out fossil fuels in a just way. And that's not going to come through an individual process of shareholder engagement. As for the relevance of the Sussex Pension Fund, you see it here, right here in the UK, when the British government decides it's going to issue new oil licenses in the North Sea. Because when it looks out at hundreds of local councils. 300 local councils have passed climate emergency resolutions. But of course, when you look at their pension funds, how many of them are actually acting on their values? So they see a sea of hypocrites out there, rather than people who actually really believe it's an emergency and are actually doing something about it. I'll leave you with a pertinent quote from Dario Kenner, who's an academic, local academic, associated with the energy group at Sussex University. It says, when BP, Shell and others talk of net zero, they are trying to stay part of the decision-making process. They want to be in charge of the transition as much as possible so they can slow it down. That is the whole point of their trying to convince society to trust them. Don't let them, and get involved with your local fossil fuel divestment campaign.
Let's just have a vote, see what people think. And it's bearing in mind the actual wording of this motion, which is this House believes that large-scale divestment is a more powerful way to stop major corporations trashing the planet than trying to engage with them. So who agrees with the motion that interesting divestment is more powerful? No, Richard, put up your hand. And who is against and thinks engagement is the more powerful way? Just to be devil's advocate,
I'm wishy-washy myself.
Okay, and who doesn't know, or who feels it's a mixture? Who feels it's a mixture of both? There we go.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.